Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Diagnosing America with Dr. Scott Barbour on the New Right Network, where we examine the signs and symptoms of the illness that's affecting America and try and come up with some common sense cures so that we can leave our children a healthy America. I'm Dr. Scott Barbour. Thanks for joining me tonight. Tonight we're going to talk about the difference between socialized medicine and free market medicine, and try and give you guys a little bit of an understanding about why I'm an advocate of free market medicine and why you should be as well. Basically, when we think about our healthcare, the things that we want to have are quality of care, meaning when you go to the doctor with a disease or an illness or an injury, you want them to have a solution to your problem. You want them to be able to cure your illness. That's quality. You want to have access to healthcare, meaning when you're sick or injured, you want to be able to find a doctor who's willing to treat whatever it is that's wrong with you. And the final thing is you want to have the lowest possible cost. So highest quality, access to care with the most choices and the lowest cost we see in a free market medicine type situation. Socialized medicine, where the government sets the policy, where the government defines what medical cares will be administered, the cost of that care, and the access to that care, we see rationing and shortages. And we see this all over the world, whether it's in your favorite Scandinavian country, whether it's Cuba or anywhere else where they have socialized medicine. Patients in those communities experience shortages, lack of access to care, and relative low quality of care. Now, a lot of this I learned by doing. When I first got into medicine, I basically had an idea that I was going to go to school, I was going to learn my craft to the best of my ability, and I was going to compete in a free market environment. And I felt that I would have a great quality of life in terms of my passion, which is taking care of patients, and that I would eventually be good at this and be able to make a living and be able to take care of my family. Now, we all have this concept that we would all like to share things evenly, and unfortunately that's just not the way the world works. And we all use the example, or at least I use the example with my children about grades. If you have your kids go to school and they work hard and they study and they don't spend a lot of time doing outside activities and goofing off, and they get good grades, the idea that you're going to go to the classroom and average everybody's grades so that everybody gets a C is not fair to the people who get A's, and it's not fair to the people who get C's, it's not fair for the people who get F's and end up getting a C, because you're taking points away from the people who sacrificed and worked hard. And eventually what happens is the people who are getting the A's stop working hard, they stop putting in the effort, and they work hard enough only to get a C. And this affects the overall quality of our education system, and it's no different in healthcare, and I've seen it with my own eyes. And I'm going to give you a few anecdotes that I've experienced in my life to help illustrate why free market medicine is the best type of medicine. Now, at the end of the day, I can remember being in high school and my father asking me what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I told him, obviously, I want to be a professional soccer player. And he asked me to think about what might happen if I were to sustain an injury, or after I finished playing, what would I do? And I said, well, I hadn't given it much thought. And he said, you need to give it some thought. There's a lot of things to consider in the type of job that you want to do for the rest of your life. You have to consider, do you want to work with your hands? Do you want to work indoors or outdoors? How much money do you want to make? Do you want to have vacation? Do you want to be the boss? Do you want to get done early? Do you want to stay late? He opened up my eyes, and he made me realize that there were certain things that were important to me. First of all, I wanted to make enough money that I could afford to pay my bills. I know my parents struggled a bit. I looked at the way they dealt with money, and I felt that that was something that that was a situation that I didn't want to be in. I wanted to be able to make enough money that I could provide for my family and not really have to worry about it. I knew I wanted to do something that was difficult and that would occupy my mind. I wanted something challenging. I wanted to be able to work with my hands, and I wanted to do something where I could help people. My mother was a nurse, and so I was exposed to medicine early on, And becoming a doctor seemed like a good idea to me. I felt like I'd have job security, I'd make a decent living, and I'd have a challenging profession that would be rewarding for the rest of my life. And so I embarked on the journey to become a doctor. And that meant when I was in college, I had to take a lot of science courses. I had to take labs on Fridays, which was no fun. When a lot of the kids were sort of getting ready for the weekend and going off to have a good time, I would always have to trudge off to these labs that would go until 5 o'clock on Friday. And I can remember looking out the big pane glass window at UC Berkeley outside into the Bears lair, and I could see everybody enjoying their weekend and thinking to myself, I'd rather be getting away from this Bunsen burner and get out with my friends. But I soldiered on and I studied, and eventually I got into medical school. And when I showed up to medical school, I was met with a number of people, all of whom came from various backgrounds. The one thing that everybody had in common is they were good at taking standardized tests, and they were all very educated people. But that was sort of the end of it. There were different kind of personalities. There were people who were like any cross-section of the world. There were people like me who were very aggressive and determined and focused, and there were other people that were sort of more carefree, and every other personality type in between. And the pursuit of a medical degree was very difficult. That was 4 years of the most difficult years of my life, and probably the least enjoyable years of my life. In the first 2 years, I read between 4 and 8 hours a day, sometimes more, but no less than 4 to 8 hours a day, every single day except for 8 days in those 2 years. And this was not light reading. This was biochemistry and microbiology and physiology and anatomy, and memorizing all of this stuff. And I can remember sitting at my desk late at night and wishing that I didn't have to put so much effort into it. I used to bargain with God, why can't we just have some kind of minimum amount of knowledge that we can obtain? Why do we have to know this in such detail? Why do we have to know so much of it? And week after week, test after test, constantly in competition, and it became very stressful. Somewhere at the end of the second year, we took our first board examination, and this was a 2-day examination that lasted all day for 2 days and tested us on basically everything that we had learned in the first 2 years. And it was probably the smartest day of my life. That was a day that I knew most of everything, and it was an extremely stressful exam, because this exam was going to determine if I was going to be able to become an orthopedic surgeon, which ultimately was my goal. And in order to get into competitive specialties, you have to graduate at the top of your class, and you have to get good board scores. And for those of you who listened to my last episode, you know that the academic part was not my strong suit, but I really applied myself. I studied and I worked really hard. And I watched my late 20s disappear in the classroom. Now, I'm not expecting anybody to cry for me. I'm just saying that it was a very difficult decision to make, and I made it with the expectation that there was going to be some sort of reward at the end of the day. I went on to the second 2 years. We worked late, and the job was very rewarding, but I began to see some other things that I didn't expect. I saw that a lot of medicine was taking care of people who had chronic diseases, and a lot of them made poor decisions. So we saw people that had multiple pregnancies with multiple significant others, bringing children into the world that were not married and really didn't have the resources to take care of these children. And I just made the observation, it seemed odd to me, you had one child when you couldn't afford the last one you had, and you went out to have another one, and people were actually from time to time bragging about the fact that they knew how to game the system, and as soon as they had one child, they were going to go out and get pregnant again so that they could gain access to more assistance. Now, I didn't really give it much thought at the time in the sense of the cost of healthcare and the availability of resources for the rest of us. I just sort of thought there are some people making some bad decisions. I can remember one night when I was first exposed to the trauma center, there was a patient that came in by ambulance who had chronic lung disease because of cigarette smoking. And they'd gotten cancer and eventually had a thing called a tracheostomy, where they make a little hole in your neck right here so that you can breathe. And this person was in respiratory distress, as they had been so often because they keep smoking. They came into the emergency room, and I can remember resuscitating this patient and getting them to the point where they could breathe again. And I remember turning around and noticing that this person was gone, and I was looking around the emergency room, where had they gone? And I noticed that they went back out onto the parking deck and started smoking through their tracheostomy, and that really made an impression on me. How much did that ambulance ride cost? And why do they keep doing this week after week after week? And who's paying for this? Because this patient wasn't able to pay for this health care. We were paying for this health care. Now, I'm not making any comment about treating people. This is what I do for a living, and I deliver more charity care now than I ever have because I'm successful and I have the ability to do charity. And taking care of people is what I want to do. I'm merely stating that there are a lot of resources that get expended by people that are making decisions that maybe the rest of us wouldn't agree with. And this is important because when the government rations healthcare, you have to understand that people who make poor decisions are getting the same healthcare as people who are making good decisions. And this affects the level of care that you're going to be able to get. Now, a lot of times the government, when they try to sell socialized medicine like Obamacare, they'll try and tell you that we have a certain level of health care and it costs X amount of dollars, and they're going to give you health care and it's going to cost less. But what they don't tell you is that the type of care that you have in a free market system is much better and much more inclusive than the type of medicine you have in a socialized system. Socialized systems have very limited quality of care, very limited access to care, and the overall cost is much higher than it would be in a free market system, but this money is distributed in a socialized policy, meaning that the people who can afford to pay more, and the people who can't afford it pay less. When I was in residency, we were able to see kind of how free market medicine and socialized medicine worked because of the different systems that we worked in. So when I went through my training, I worked at a trauma center that was one of the biggest trauma centers in the country, and we had patients coming in through the trauma center. There were hundreds of patients in this trauma center at any one time that were injured in any manner of type of injury, including shark attack, being run over by a boat, falling from a plane, falling from a building, being impaled by rebar, car accidents, gunshot wounds, and anything else that you could possibly imagine. We saw this. And the interesting thing about trauma is that it crosses across all socioeconomic levels. You don't really see an increased incidence in the numbers of traumas based on somebody's socioeconomic level or the decisions that they make. It kind of cuts across all swaths. Now, in the trauma center, you're going to see both a combination of free market medicine and you're going to see a little bit of socialized government-run medicine. So basically, our social contract says that we want to treat everybody who comes to the emergency room, regardless of their ability to pay, and I actually think that that's a good idea. I do believe that there should be some safety net, but you will see people who come to the trauma center with injuries and they don't want to pay their medical bills because they're paying off their boat or other things. We've gotten into a situation in this country where people don't value their health care, and so they don't feel the need to pay for it. They think it should be provided to them. But you can't provide anything to anybody without first compelling somebody else to provide that service, and that's called slavery. Now, we worked at multiple different facilities. This trauma center, we worked at two other hospitals that were private hospitals, meaning patients had insurance and they were able to choose their doctors. And they were able to demand service. Now, when they came to the private hospitals, we as residents did a lot of the work, but the primary attending physicians were very much involved in their care because these were so-called paying customers, meaning that they expected and demanded to see the physician who had the experience and whose name was on the door, and not one of the residents that was helping. So we as residents were able to do much less in terms of our hands-on experience with these patients. In the trauma center and over at the VA, where it was pure government, we had basically the lion's share of the work to do. We did all of the surgeries, and the primary attendings had very little interaction with those patients. We used to have patients that would come to the trauma center, and those who had private insurance would follow up in the attending physician's private clinic. And so it would be at the NICE facility. They'd make an appointment. There would be a lot of customer service. They'd have time to sit down and chat with the doctor taking care of them. Basically the kind of service that you would expect when you pay to see a doctor. In the staff clinic that was run by the residents is where the people with no insurance and the indigent patients would be seen. And so basically we divided up these clinics and covered them with residents ranging from second-year residents all the way up to fifth-year residents. And so the care that they got was adequate, but obviously the people that they saw were incompletely trained. And one of the things that I noticed there was patients would come in with injuries, and they would be treated. They would eventually be healed, and then they would show up back into the clinic with paperwork. And this paperwork was basically disability paperwork, and they would put it in front of an overworked resident. I can remember times I could barely keep my eyes open. I barely knew how to provide the medical care that I was providing because I was still in training. And this person would put a piece of paper in front of me and start screaming at me and say they're not leaving until I sign this piece of paper. And, I thought to myself, I sign it, I don't know what it is. But basically I'm putting a medical signature on this document that's disability paperwork, and then these people are able to take it and go get more assistance. I can remember one person in particular was an 18-year-old male. He broke his ankle. We treated it. He was healed, and he was healed to the point where he could go play tackle football or participate in any activity that he wanted to, and he managed to bring some disability paperwork into me. And I told him that I wasn't going to sign it, and he started laughing at me, and I said, "This is not funny. You are not a disabled person." And he just waited in the clinic, and he eventually went up to another resident who signed the paperwork. And the guy, as he was walking out the door, he looked at me and he waved the paper in my face, sort of rubbing it in my nose in the fact that he had got his signature and was able to go get his disability paperwork. This happened over and over and over again at my hospital facility, and I used to sit and think, man, who is paying for all of this government care? A lot of this stuff was also disability paperwork. So people who weren't actually disabled would get a doctor's signature, but a resident who basically was overworked, overtired, really just wanted to get this patient out of the clinic, and they felt the easiest way to do it was to sign this paperwork. And so somebody who's not disabled now has a doctor's signature and is able to go fill their paperwork. So we can see some inherent flaws in a system where this is completely government run. There's no accountability, and also the quality of the care that they're receiving is at the lower end because it's being managed by incompletely trained doctors. Now, the VA system is the worst system of all. That is 100% government-run medicine, and that really opened my eyes as to making me aware that government-run healthcare is not something that we want. Now, the emergency room at the VA is run by residents from the hospital where I worked. Now, these residents were internal medicine residents, and so they, again, were incompletely trained doctors. They would see people in the emergency room, and usually patients come to the emergency room for musculoskeletal type injuries, basically orthopedic type injuries, shoulder pain and knee pain and ankle pain. And these internal medicine residents would order x-rays, which is sort of a standard way of evaluating a painful joint. And they were they did not have the ability to read the x-rays. And so they would consult the orthopedic surgeon on call, which was usually a person like me who was over at the trauma center doing other work. And so when I would get a call from the VA, I would have to wait till I had some free time where I could walk over to the VA and look at the x-ray. And in many cases, this took hours and hours and hours. So you can imagine, you hurt your ankle, you twisted your ankle, you hurt your shoulder, you go to the emergency room, the doctor takes an x-ray, and then 4, 5, 6 hours later, somebody comes over and says, okay, x-ray is normal, you basically just got a little sprain, and you can go. In a private system, you pay radiologists who are on staff, and when you come in, you get evaluated. A radiologist or somebody who's trained to read your x-rays, read these x-rays, and give you the results that you need in a timely fashion and basically give you good quality service. The VA is a government-run system, and so they don't pay for providers, they don't pay for adequate nursing and other things, and so the overall service that's delivered is substandard. Another problem is you have this sort of government mentality where everybody is paid the same, and nobody can nobody can do a poor enough job to be fired. And I saw this firsthand. The system is designed to protect the employees and not designed to provide a good service. And I can remember one time I was working in the emergency room in the orthopedic department, and I was working through my patients, and it was an especially busy day. And so I realized that if I didn't work through lunch, I was going to leave patients for the person coming in on call that night, and I didn't want to do that. So I worked through lunch, and my assistant, who was employed by the hospital, worked through lunch with me. After we finished the day, I went home, and then I went back to work over the next several weeks, and I didn't see this person. And about 3 weeks later, I saw him, and I said, "Hey, Miguel, where have you been?" And he said, "You remember that day that we worked through lunch?" And I said, "Yeah, I remember." And he goes, "I was suspended." And I said, "What?" And he says, "Yeah, I was suspended for not taking my lunch break." This was amazing to me. I couldn't even imagine that this happens in this country, that somebody does a good job, goes above and beyond to try and deliver his service, and the system punishes him because he's setting a precedent that the other employees do not want to meet. When I first got to the VA, I was there with, I believe I was a third year, and I was there with a fifth year. So a fifth year resident and a third year resident sort of run the orthopedic department at the VA. And we noticed that the flow of our operating room was slow because the employees around us refused to do their job. And so we felt that if they're not going to do it, we'll just do it. And we could increase the output and do a better job for our patients. And so we would go to the operating room. We would go up to the holding area. We'd take the patient. We'd wheel them down to the operating room, put them on the operating table. We'd prep the patient and get them all ready for surgery. We'd scrub in. We'd do the operation. If I needed any equipment, I would scrub out myself and go to the core, which is where they keep all the things we need. I'd get the equipment. I'd bring it. I'd scrub back in. I'd finish the operation. When I was done, I would take the patient. I'd put them on the gurney and wheel them into the recovery room. We'd come back into the operating room, and I'd get the mop out, and I would mop the floor. I would clean the beds and do what we call turning over the room to get it ready for the next patient. When I was done turning over the room, I'd go back up to the holding area, get the next patient, and wheel it down. And as a result, we tripled our output. And I was really proud of the fact that we were able to do this. I felt like we were delivering a better service for the patients, and my partner and I were very proud of ourselves. About 3 weeks passed, and we got called into the head of the hospital's office. And while we were in the elevator on the way up, my partner and I were both thinking that we were probably going to get medals, get a big pat on the back for the great job we were doing. And instead, we were reprimanded and threatened that if we did not stop messing with the system, that he was going to give us a bad recommendation and make sure that we did not get the fellowships that we wanted to get after our residency. And needless to say, we were both stunned that this is how the system works. But the problem was for this person is that the other employees had work created for them by the work that we were doing, and they complained about it. And rather than fix the system, we were basically reprimanded and told to stop doing the extra work and let the system work the way it's designed to work, which is basically very, very poorly. And so After that reprimand, we stopped working. We basically spent the remainder of the rotation in the call room. We did very little. We let the medical students do the majority of the labor. And when we were done, the person who was running the hospital actually called us in and gave us accolades for our great efforts. This is not a unique story to the VA. This happens across the country. I've worked in VAs from coast to coast for 10 years. A lot of times I'll hear patients say, I went to the VA and I had a good experience. And this may be true. I mean, from time to time, you know, I've gone to the DMV and I've had a good experience. If you've come to the VA and I was there, you might have had a good experience because I'm a good doctor. But that's not the standard, and that's not the VA is not the system that we want to employ. And because it's set up like a bureaucracy, because it's a top-down government-run system, bureaucrats make the decisions. Doctors and patients don't make the decisions. They will not fire anybody for poor work product. They don't promote anybody for good work product. In fact, it works the other way. One time I was in a trauma, and there was a nurse that was well known who was not a very good nurse, and she was having a fight with the chief resident. And it was a trauma situation where the patient came in with a pelvic fracture, and we were putting on what's known as a pelvic X-fix, which are some pins into the pelvis, and basically what you're trying to do is prevent bleeding in the pelvis and you know, stop a patient from bleeding to death. It's a very serious situation, and I was a young resident at the time, probably I think I was actually an intern. So I'm in this setting, I'm helping, and you know, it's a very exciting time, but it was also a very scary time. And this resident was putting on the pelvic external fixator, and this particular nurse was giving him a hard time, and they were fighting back and forth. And to spite him, she took the sterile pelvic X-fix equipment and dropped it on the floor, sort of to rub his nose in it. And he used an expletive with her that I'm not going to say, but it begins with an F. And I was stunned. We're in the middle of a trauma situation where somebody's life is on the line, and this nurse, in order to spite this doctor, dropped this sterile equipment on the floor to sort of make her point. Well, we eventually got through the operation. The patient survived. We got the operation done, and the administrator who was in charge of the operating room came down to assess the situation. And the chief resident explained the situation, that this nurse had purposely dropped this sterile instrumentation on the floor. And the administrator could not get over the fact that he swore at her. And she was not very impressed by the fact that this nurse had dropped the sterile equipment on the floor. She was flabbergasted that the resident had used an expletive with her and reprimanded the resident. Now, in order to solve the situation, this particular nurse was promoted to the head of the operating room, and the thinking of the bureaucrats was, let's get her out of the operating where she has interaction with the doctor, she can run the department, and this somehow is going to make the system better. So promoting people out of serious situations is a common practice at these bureaucracies, and again, it's not what we want with socialized medicine. Now, I can remember when I did my first knee replacement, I was at the VA, and basically in order to do these knee replacements, we had to get supervision from more experienced doctors. And so we typically would go out into the community and try and find a doctor who was willing to proctor us while we did this operation. And I found a doctor, and he proctored me, and I did the case. And the point I'm trying to make is, when you have a relationship with a doctor, you know, like if a patient comes to see me and I operate on them, I own that patient. I own everything that happens to them, and I'm intimately involved with it. When I went and got this proctor, the proctor was sort of peripherally involved. The patient didn't even know his name. I was really the person in charge, as inexperienced as I was. And you can see how this type of system is set up so that you know, patients, although they're getting a knee replacement, they don't get the same knee replacement that somebody in a private healthcare system gets. Now, when you think about socialized medicine, they'll talk about care. And that what they mean is a card in your pocket. Now, a card in your pocket does not mean you have care or access to care. And a lot of people, especially people who live in socialized countries, feel comfortable when they have the card when they've never had to access the system. It's only after they access the system and realize that they can't get the goods and services that they need that they realize that their health care was wholly inadequate. Now, in a free market system like we used to have in this country, we have so much available to us, so many choices, so many options to deliver high quality care that patients usually can receive the services that they need. And I'll give you a couple of examples. In my practice, I have 6 clinics, and I currently own 2 MRIs as one doctor. There are entire provinces in Canada that have 1 MRI for the entire province. So obviously people in Canada have much less access to MRI than you have in this country. And that's just one facet of healthcare. I'm one type of doctor practicing one type of medicine. There are infinite number of interactions that happen in this country that demonstrate the level of care that we have here. Now, we do not have a pure free market system in this country, and it's gotten worse over the last 20 years. And now I've been practicing for about 16, 17 years now, and I've really seen a demise in our healthcare system, especially with the passage of Obamacare. When I first got out of training, I wanted to earn patients, and I didn't have any. I opened my first practice, and when I was on call and a patient came to the emergency room, I got out of bed. I would drive to the emergency room. I'd go in. I would meet the family. I would talk to the family. I would talk to the patient, and I would try and get that operation done as fast as possible because I was trying to deliver a service, and I wanted these patients to go out in the community and tell their friends that they had a good experience. In my mind, I would be building market share, and by delivering good service over and over again, I would build my practice and eventually make more money. Eventually, hospitals sort of gained control of the apparatus of medicine, so they employed many of the physicians. Hospitals sort of came to the table with the insurance companies and big pharma to sort of box us in so that they control the entire system. When I first started training, I was a customer for the hospital, meaning the hospital wanted to treat me well because they were competing with other hospitals for my business, and they wanted me to bring my patients to their facility so that they could make money by putting in knee replacements and doing every kind of operation that I would do. Over time, though, the hospitals became more and more dependent on government. More and more private doctors were driven out of business because of decreasing reimbursements from insurance companies that did not pay enough money for doctors to keep the lights on. And rather than go bankrupt, doctors eventually abandoned their private practices and became employed by the hospitals. Once the hospitals got the doctors employed, they now had all of the levers to deliver the health care, and the doctors no longer became accountable to the patients. They became accountable to the hospitals. And I've seen the quality of care diminish. When I first started practicing, if a patient came to the emergency room with a broken hip and they were treated by another surgeon the year before for the other hip, it was common courtesy for me to call that surgeon and let them know that I had their patient here, and they would commonly come in and say, "Oh yeah, let me take care of Mrs. Jones. I took care of her hip last year." Nowadays, that call never occurs, and even if it did, the doctor would complain, "Why did you bother calling me?" Because there's not enough reimbursement to make treating that patient worthwhile. So where it used to be a situation where doctors were fighting to deliver service, now you can barely get somebody to come in and see the patient. And certainly, since there's no incentive to go in and earn business because you're employed by the hospital, doctors don't come in at night anymore. They wait till the next day and they do the minimum. Now, because the administrative state has taken over control of the hospitals, the hospitals have sort of controlled the flow of patients, and they basically will direct patients to their employed physicians. These employed physicians are monitored in every way, and certain arbitrary measures are used to go as a knock against the doctor. For example, if you come in and you get admitted to a physician and they take care of you and then they discharge you, if you readmit that patient within the next 30 days, that's a knock against the doctor, and the doctor is actually incentivized not to want to readmit you, whether it's medically necessary or not. And I think you don't have to be a doctor to understand that sometimes you get out of the hospital and things can happen and you need to be readmitted, and you don't want the doctor feeling like they're going to take a knock from the insurance company, meaning decreased reimbursement if they readmit you. You want them to just treat you based on your medical needs and not how you're going to reflect on their record as a physician. The hospitals, I know, have come to these arbitrary measurements to try and monitor the quality of their work with nothing relevant to healthcare. I sit in these meetings where we talk about where we stand with our Medicare evaluations, and none of the statistics have anything to do with the quality of healthcare, and we've really seen a decline. Now, a lot of patients don't realize that this decline has occurred because they haven't had to access the system. But I think if you guys have tried to make an appointment for your parents who have Medicare, you find that it's more and more difficult to find a physician who's accepting Medicare claims. And Medicaid, people weren't accepting Medicaid even before I started. And so this increased government takeover of healthcare has really had a deleterious effect on the quality of our care, and it isn't over yet. We elected these current bunch of politicians with the idea that they were going to repeal Obamacare, and they had an opportunity to repeal Obamacare, and they refused to do it. And the reason is the big donors, the hospital systems, the insurance companies, and Big Pharma, among others, don't want them to take over this, or they don't want them to relinquish this monopoly they have on our healthcare dollars, because it's lucrative for them, and the politicians have power when they have the ability to control our healthcare. It's very important that we continue to put pressure on our politicians, on our local representatives, and demand that they allow us to move back towards free market medicine, because the costs are getting out of control, and many of you will realize now that the premiums have gotten to be so high that most people can't afford them. And even if you do get sick or injured, your deductibles are so high, $5,000 or $10,000, that you're essentially paying cash for anything on top of these massive premiums, and you're really getting poor quality and poor return on your investment. A lot of people don't realize that a lot of areas of healthcare have simply gone away. Pain management is a big one. There are a lot of people out there who have chronic pain syndromes and need access to a pain management doctor, but decreasing reimbursement and difficulty with managing the pain management bureaucracy has driven doctors away from that discipline. It's not a place where they can make money, and so doctors have simply elected to stop participating in that area of medicine, and consequently we have a lot of patients with chronic pain syndromes who can't find a doctor and can't get access to care. And this is what we see in a socialized system. We see rationing of care, and we eventually see we see the system break down so that we see loss of services. Now, a lot of you may remember, or at least I remember, that right at the height of the Obamacare debates, the Premier of Newfoundland in Canada had a cardiac condition that was not treated anywhere in Canada. And so this person flew down to Miami to receive his heart surgery, and the person was a big advocate for socialized medicine. And when confronted with the fact that he came to the United States to get his care, he simply said, "It's my health, I can do whatever I want." And this is kind of the attitude of elitists. Most people in Canada don't have the opportunity to simply fly to Miami and pay cash for their cardiac system. They're trapped in the socialized system that they have up in Canada. Just to kind of give you an idea of the apples to oranges comparison between free market medicine and socialized medicine, in Canada, they don't treat stage 4 colon cancer. And you guys may remember Herman Herman Cain, who ran for president, he had stage 4 colon cancer, and because he lived in the United States and was able to find the doctors he needed to find and get the workup that he needed to get up and get the treatment that he needed to get, he survived and was able to run for president, and he's here for his wife and his children. In Canada, they simply don't treat stage 4 colon cancer. If you have it, you're basically at the mercy of your disease. When I first got out of my training, I really wanted to be a complete sports medicine doctor, and one of the things that I hadn't done was a procedure called hip arthroscopy. And I wanted to know about it, and I started noticing patients in my clinic who had hip pain, and their MRIs were normal, their x-rays were normal, and I couldn't really figure out what was going on. Turned out a friend of mine from residency was doing some work in this area, and I called him, and he asked me, or he invited me to come up and see him in Pittsburgh, and I flew up to go see him and watched him operate, and he sort of taught me what he knew. I went back to my own clinic, and I found patients that had chronic hip problems, and I took shoulder instruments and put them into the hip joint, and I essentially just figured out how to solve this problem. And over 20 years, I've learned a lot. I've gotten better at it. Companies have developed instruments that are longer, that are designed for the hip, unique tools, and now 20 years later, we have a whole discipline of medicine in my area, one small area that didn't even exist when I was going through my training. If I was to come out today, I couldn't even do these operations because insurance companies would not allow me to take a patient to the operating room with some unknown condition and simply explore. And this is a problem because this is how medicine progresses. Doctors are incentivized to follow their experience, follow their training, follow their research, and to find newer, better ways to deliver healthcare, smaller incisions, faster recovery times. And right now we have a government that is just a big wet blanket. Administrators that are preventing us from using the knowledge that we spent so much time trying to obtain and the skills that we have, and instead we're being controlled by administrators who really have all of the decision-making power in these insurance companies, the hospital systems, the big pharma. They're all trying to keep control of our healthcare, and the politicians, most of all, want to be able to control our healthcare. We need to demand that we get it back, and that's only going to happen if we stay on top of our politicians and demand that they, first of all, repeal Obamacare. We need to have more competition in the marketplace. We need to teach people that they need to value their health care, that you get what you pay for. And if we're basically going to put a gun to doctors' heads and expect them to care for us, we're not going to get a very good quality product. And I think many of us who've had to access the healthcare system can already see that, and it's only going to get worse. Now, we're going to talk on this program about healthcare. We're going to talk about other issues because my experiences in healthcare have sort of given me exposure to some other issues that we're having in the education system and in business. And we want to figure out all of these problems and try and figure out how to get America back on track. So if you're like me and you're sick and tired of an IRS department that is targeting American citizens, that a government that goes on TV and lies on every single Sunday show about Benghazi being about a YouTube video, that the president looking into the camera and telling us that if we like to keep our doctor, we can keep our doctor, but in reality we can't. When Hillary Clinton has a private email server in her basement and has classified emails on that server, and the law says you simply can't have classified emails on a private server, and everybody looks the other way in the media, then you're tuning into the right place, because as citizens, we have to get involved. We have to take control of our schools, take control of our healthcare, take control of our local governments, our business community, and get America back on track. And remember, you can't find a cure if you don't first diagnose disease. So join us next time for another episode of Diagnosing America with Dr. Scott Barbour on the New Right Network. I appreciate you guys tuning in tonight.